Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, José Granados, Ceja, Mexican journalist living and working here in Mexico City. I'm a staff writer and host of the podcast over at Venezuela Analysis, as well as a presenter on Sin Muros on Mexico's Canal 11. And as always, I am joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Doing very well, José Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States. Canal 11 here in Mexico City. Ready for another episode. Hold on, listen. Before we do the guns, there's that big building down the street, and its doors were closed for 3 years. I think we did a video in front of it.
Yes, that's right. In fact, we recorded a promo in front of that space.
And I was just walking by there just today, and I was just so used to the doors always being closed, and they were open. Do you know
what?
Do you know anything about that?
You know what? I happen to know exactly what that's about. It's this.
Oh!
After nearly 3 years closed, the Supreme Court of Justice of the Nation reopened its main doors. And those of you who are fans of the show probably saw our little preview clip that we recorded just outside the doors, where we made a point of mentioning the fact that, you would think that, the seat of one of the powers, the poderes, right? One of the branches of government.
Branches of government, yeah.
Would be open in the same way that, with the right permissions, you can go into the Congress, into the Senate, into the National Palace, the other seats. But this one was closed, and finally, it's reopened.
Open to the people.
And why is that?
Well, let's do the guns first.
Oh, sorry.
Here we go. Soberanía. All right. Why is that? That's because, young man, we now have a new Supreme Court in this country. The judicial reform went through all the hoops. Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, the election of last year, the 2/3 majority, the constitutional reform, the election of a few months ago, all of the appeals against it, which were all finally thrown out by one vote, as it turned out in the electoral tribunal.
Just barely.
By one vote. And so now we have, as a result of all that, a publicly elected, totally brand spanking new Supreme Court that just sat for the first time yesterday, right down the street from here.
Amazing.
And the doors are open for the first time in 3 years. Because remember the joke that the former Chief Justice Norma Pina was, shredding documents there
and stealing artwork, apparently.
And stealing. This is not a joke, actually.
No.
There's over 1,000 pieces that are missing, right?
What? Doesn't that say it all? It really does.
Yeah.
I'll share the rundown in a second, but I wanted to share this article here. Mexico ushers in a new era for its justice system with a judiciary elected by popular vote. Headline from El País International. There you have it. That's why the doors are open, because the occupants have changed and they have a different approach.
As I said in Twitter too, to the collective gnashing of teeth to international liberal elites, shadily funded NGOs. What else was on there? Energy multinationals, right? Tax cheats, right? And as we'll see later, also to Human Rights Watch.
Oh, yes.
That's a little teaser for what's coming up a little bit later in the show.
We're going to have some fun today. There's so much to talk about.
A lot to talk about.
Jumped a little bit ahead there, but we wanted to share, because you're wondering, why are they glowing? Why are they so happy? Well, it's because Mexico marks a historic day. On September 1st, not just a new Supreme Court, the first one being elected by popular vote here in Mexico, not the first one in the world. Olivia beat us to that, but certainly the first place in the world where the entire judiciary,
federal judiciary
is popularly voted on. Then we're going to be talking about Marco Rubio coming to town. He is landing on Tuesday. We'll be having meetings, and then I think he takes off for Ecuador on Wednesday with a little layover in Florida. I guess he's got to get his notes from the hard right Florida anti-left.
Say hi to the brother-in-law there.
Oh, that too.
It's funny you were making the quip in Sin Muros when we were recording today that Florida is treated like a foreign country. It's like
weird.
He's making a 3-day stopover in Florida,
Mexico,
and Ecuador. It's like,
All right, just to finish up here, the rundown, we're also being changing about the changing geopolitical chessboard. And by that, we mean we had the Shanghai Cooperation Organization having a meeting, as well as this encounter between high-level officials from Mexico and Brazil.
That chessboard is, it's been in super turbocharge thanks to, Trump, Rubio, and co. We'll talk a lot about that.
We got Vandalito Moreno. Who's Vandalito Moreno?
The head of a political party called the PRI in serious danger of extinction, and all the more so after the antics of the last week. We'll talk a lot about that as well.
And then, of course, finally, losers and haters. As Kurt said, we're going to be talking about Human Rights Watch. We haven't picked on them. I can't believe it, because they really deserve it in a lot of ways.
They kind of slipped under the radar so far. I don't know how that happened.
They've been lucky in that sense. Yeah.
We've got another bit of news here also.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I was getting into the thing. Of course.
Pizzarello! I think probably you've already seen this interview, some of you. If you haven't, we have inaugurated El Taller, long-form interviews out here in the bookbinding workshop, where we really workshop ideas and analysis regarding Mexico and its transformation with notable figures, both national and international. And we really started off con broche de oro, as I say in Spanish, with a wonderful interview, really analytic, but at the same time fun and engaging and really conversational, but really diving into things.
I've loved to see the comments we've gotten so far. People seem to be really into it. Really, and that's exactly what we wanted. We want to have a space. Obviously, we have the podcast. Podcast isn't going anywhere. But this extra space where we can kind of get into the nitty gritty of these questions with, notable international and national figures. We got a bunch of more people lined up. We'll be doing it at least once a month.
At least once a month. Sometimes we'll have more.
Maybe. Yeah.
But, our guaranteed kind of baseline is one a month. And it's really funny because, we had such a great time with Gerardo and, munching on Mexican alfajores and really covering ground on Mexico and on Spain and what a 21st century socialism could look like. And really, we covered a lot of ground. And I was thinking too, because there's a lot of theories on how to do an interview. You know? There's, the classic adversarial interview stance, which I'm very much in favor of.
There's definitely an important place for that.
But there's also sometimes something to be said for this kind of interview where it's more informal, where you can sometimes get stuff that you're not going to ever get in a, one of those formal TV studio interviews with the light shining down. And people are sometimes, more cautious. This is more of a conversation. And as you'll see here, it was very interesting, precisely because with this style of interview, and I'm not talking about lobbing softballs either, but I'm talking about kind of creating an atmosphere where you wind up getting into things and getting answers and kind of going places where the formal table studio interview, wouldn't allow, right? Or would maybe inhibit.
As I was watching it, it's like comrades having a chat.
Exactly.
It's like those conversations. I don't know if anybody's ever found themselves in a comrade's living room. It's 2 a.m. and you're just hashing it out. And I had a really good time. I do want to apologize to those of you who were expecting a dubbed version. I promise you, I tried every means of making it happen. Just tons and tons of hours staring at a screen and just couldn't make it happen. If there are some tech experts out there who want to help us out, we were able to make some progress, but ultimately it wasn't to the quality that I think you deserve. And that's why we decided to do just the subtitled version. But the subtitles are there for those of you who don't speak Spanish. And I think
by the time this is up, the good subtitles are there. Right?
Right now they're just kind of the quick translation, but we're working on making sure that they're perfect for you. And the other thing I would say is check it out. If you're not a fluent Spanish speaker, turn it on, maybe brush up on your Spanish a little bit by watching us with the subtitles on. And of course, feedback is welcome. But help us get the word out. We put a lot of work into this. We believe that this will be a really helpful contribution to the discourse happening around Mexico and left politics more generally in the hemisphere and then the world wide over. So we're really proud to be able to have it out there.
It's a way too to, expand the work of the podcast. Because the podcast, this is not an interview-based, podcast. We have a week, we've got an hour, we've got a lot to cover like we do today. So to have that extra space, to be able to talk both with national figures, but also with international figures, commenting on what's going on in Mexico is so important because so many of you are living outside of Mexico as well. And so I think it's important that you also see figures from inside of Mexico, but also figures from outside of Mexico commenting on this phenomenon. That's not just us. All right. We just got feedback from someone who's actually going to be working with us in a couple months. And he said, my father's Catalan. And, Gerardo Pisarello is, represents Catalonia in the Spanish parliament and also is in Ada Colau's, seminal left-wing government in Barcelona. He said it was just so interesting to hear someone from Catalonia commenting, who knows Mexico so well.
He does.
To comment, on it and really be able to have that in-out dialectic. And that's what we're going for there.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Now back to the stories here. Now I already shared this with you.
Now back to regular programming, already in progress.
Mexico ushers in a new era for its justice system with a judiciary elected by popular vote, but that wasn't the only historical thing to happen.
Sometimes,
sometimes they pile up. And we have...
A year happens in a week sometimes.
This story as well. President Claudia Sheinbaum's first government report. You could call it a State of the Union. I think it's probably something that our viewers and listeners will understand. Officially here. Mm-hmm. Her first one happening on September 1st, which is just 1 month shy of actual 1 year anniversary in office, because we've been trying to rearrange the actual schedule for the election to coincide a little bit better with their actual taking of power. Mm-hmm. She took office on October 1st. And so her first informe is actually coming now in September.
That's right.
But, it's actually kind of interesting because there's almost too much for her to say and talk about. I mean, this was...
Go back and watch the podcast over the course of the past year, but it has been an intense first year.
A very intense first year. And, it's always great to have this opportunity to kind of reflect on the past year. And I think that's really what was most useful for me. It's quite extraordinary when you think about it, when they lay it out and, these really polished social media videos talking about, their achievements and their plans as well, right? Like, sometimes we, especially on a weekly podcast, we kind of get bogged down in like the day to day, the intensity of doing politics in this country. Right. And when you zoom out a little bit,
keeping up with, Mexican politics is so vast.
Exactly. Exactly. So I was saying, if you just zoom out a little bit, then you have this opportunity to really take it all in, to see it all in one place, and also really reflect on the fact that this is historic, yes, because it is the second fourth transformation government, but it's also the first woman president of Mexico, giving her speech and reflecting on that and, reimagining what it means to exercise power in a country like Mexico, but also, capturing everything that led up to this moment, giving credit to López Obrador where credit was due, not leaving him out, not kind of
firmly talking about this being a continuity and the advantages of it being a continuity government.
Absolutely.
She started right with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, that was the first informe, and we've actually put it on the website for you. Again, I'll share this for you. This link on the Mexico Solidarity Media website is her speech translated to English. Yeah. So feel free to go to mexicosolidarity.com, check that out if you're interested to hear and read her speech directly. Maybe as a cleanse the palate after watching Gerardo Pisarello, if you're just so eager to learn more about what's happening here in Mexico.
Very quickly on the State of the Union. I was commenting on this on Sin Muros today. Neoliberal governments in Mexico, but elsewhere as well, kind of their only kind of calling card is like, we maintain macroeconomic stability. Yeah. Like, we're the only ones who can do it, right? This was their idea. And so I'm sorry, we can't have this social program or this initiative or that or anything that would help the people because we have to maintain macroeconomic stability. And that's the only thing. And actually, Mexico's government, neoliberal governments, didn't even do that because there was actually a slow motion devaluation of the peso of 100% over just Fox, Calderon, and Peña Nieto. No? It was just slower than the devaluations of 82 and 94, right? So that's their calling card. What we see here is, a 4T that up until now has been able to do both. Maintain macroeconomic stability and build out a welfare state and do, the big ticket infrastructure projects, right? And now take the next step of, beyond education and health and the areas that it's housing, the, million plus new units, really jumping with both feet into scientific innovation. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But, the news is good with regards to macroeconomic indicators. And this is in the face of Trump's threats and the tariff threats and such. So Mexico's probably going to grow at 1.2% this year, which is not great. But it's in the context of, the main international bodies were predicting a recession or negative growth. Foreign direct investment reached a record high in the first half of the year, registering more than $36 billion, right? So, foreign investment is not being scared off by the tariff threats. The number of
as we talked about in a previous episode, it's actually at historic highs.
It's at historic highs. The number of international visitors to Mexico grew by 13.8% compared to the same period of the previous year. So in the same vein as foreign direct investment, tourists are not being put off by tariff threats or by, very politicized State Department warnings, travel warnings.
They might be put off of wanting to visit the United States and are coming here instead.
Yeah, that's probably actually a factor, right?
Yeah. Plus, it's cheaper, and the beaches are better. Sorry.
So 13.8% higher on international visitors. The currency remains below 19 pesos a dollar. Unemployment is at 2.7%. And annual inflation, listen to this, was at 3.5%, the lowest level since January of 2021. And that's taking into account the real increase in the minimum wage has been 135% since 2018. And that has been one of the biggest successes of all of this, is to ignore the shibboleths and ignore the warnings from very important people in capital VIP internationally. Said, it's going to be inflationary. Well, it wasn't, and it hasn't been. So that's the macroeconomic side of it. Federal government revenues are up, topped 5.595 trillion pesos as of August 31st, 8.5% higher in real terms than in 2024, and above what was projected in the revenue law. And with all that, public debt stood as of at the end of August at 50% of GDP. Whereas in the United States, it's at, I think, 120% or heading towards 125%, thanks to the big, beautiful bill.
This is what I mean. I mean, when you put that all together in one place, like it's quite extraordinary, especially if you take into consideration the context in which this is all happening. These are under very adverse circumstances, through no fault of our own, because of who occupies the White House.
And at the same time, as the social programs we've talked about, the minimum wage increases and all that, the science stuff, that's interesting. The Alinea electric mini vehicle, the Kutsari semiconductor design workshop project, the Ixtli observation satellites, the Meta-Oceanic System for Climate Monitoring and Civil Protection, and Quetzal, the design and production of a next-generation unmanned aerial vehicle. I guess that means drones, right? But Mexican drones. And,
to shoot down the gringo ones.
To shoot down the gringo ones. We can have the air wars, right? But, this really indicates that Mexico now has the self-confidence to do scientific innovation. After so many decades of this idea of the only thing that Mexico has to give to the world is cheap labor and maquiladoras. Cheap labor and, assembly plants. That's it. That's all we can do. That was the idea inculcated by, administration after administration after administration.
And in some ways it's summed up by the phrase that the president used herself, which is the neoliberal model is dead.
Yeah.
I also really liked what she had to say, when she's like,
justice.
Things are going well and they're going to get better. I like that.
Well, this is another point. Right? And I mentioned this also earlier in the program today. Over and above all the numbers we can throw at you and, the programs and the innovation over else, there was a sense of optimism in this informing that was just a marked contrast, both with Donald Trump's revanchism and this dark, this idea that all the world is doing stuff to us, right? All the world is doing stuff to us with the trade deficits and all of that, and they're threatening, and the China, this kind of inward-looking, kind of glowering, paranoia of the world is all against us kind of thing. Well, gee, what has the U.S. been doing in the world to deserve that? This, right? Compared with this optimism of a Sheinbaum, and I was saying, you'd have to go back to a Kennedy to have that kind of sense of optimism in the U.S., early 60s. We know who Kennedy was and what Kennedy did and a lot of things, right? But I'm talking about the sense of optimism at that time in the early 60s,
absolutely.
Right? With Kennedy, with the New Frontier, with Johnson, with the war on poverty before, U.S. imperial foreign policy swept that all away, right? Vietnam and such. Right? But that's the sense you get. And it's a huge contrast both with Trumpism and the revanchism and the racism and the paranoia and all of that, the violence, the aggressiveness, the nastiness. And of course, with figures also within Mexico, like Alito Moreno, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the program, the head of the PRI party, going up and, slugging another senator up at the podium of the Senate last week, the Comisión Permanente, kicking and pushing and shoving a cameraman to the ground and threatening him.
And then
the contrast couldn't have been starker between that kind of nasty violence of the parties of the past and this kind of optimism in this Informe.
I was going to say doubling down on this threat, saying I'm going to punch him again, and then showing up to the Congress
yesterday,
again with his gang. It's hard to call this a political party anymore. His gang of thugs to try to shut down the session, being a rump element of the Congress, right? It'd be one thing if it was like, okay, the government is doing something that we are steadfastly opposed to, that the population opposes. But these are just minor players trying to punch above their weight.
Maintain relevance in a system that has passed them by. And in Alito's case, who's got a series of criminal charges pending against him, but he's got political immunity.
Yeah.
So
we'll get into him in just a minute.
Later. So that's the Informe, right?
Yeah. Well, allow me to talk a little bit about the new Supreme Court. There's been a lot of, frankly, racist response on social media.
Oh, yeah.
Because they decided to put emphasis on Mexico's indigenous roots. And why? Well, because the new head of the Supreme Court, who is the head of the Supreme Court for the next year, precisely because he received the most votes in Mexico's first election of the judiciary, is a Mixteco man. He's an activist. He's an indigenous man, Hugo Ortiz. And he wanted to put that front and center to also highlight the fact that, and I think he was absolutely correct on this, which is that this wouldn't have happened had it not been for the judicial reform. To say that somebody like him could make it to the highest seat in the judiciary because of the transformation that this country is living. And he was unequivocal about it. And he's absolutely right. And that thank goodness we have this opportunity to see the head of the Supreme Court embrace his indigenous roots, celebrate them, share it, because obviously not everybody on the Supreme Court is likewise indigenous. They're mestizo and they're white, and to bask in this.
That has been very historically white.
Oh, absolutely, and that's what I was going to get to, right? Like to say that this is Mexico, right? And it is multicultural, it is diverse, right? But there is a certain sense of pride, of anti-colonial kind of vision to say, hey, our traditional ways of honoring leadership should also play a healthy role. And of course, what have we seen? Like I said, just a terribly racist response. But I think most of it is informed by the fact that the game's changed. The new Supreme Court means, they're not going to be able to, the elites are not going to be able to get away with all their shenanigans that they used to be able to. Or even people who, I'm not going to say any names, but we share some spaces with them, talk openly about how they used to have to bribe judges in order to get the results that they wanted. I mean, obviously we're on day 2 of their administration. We want to have that hope that it means the end of this kind of corruption in the judiciary, right? That is my expectation for sure. That's one of the number one things that I think needs to happen in order to end impunity in this country and actually move forward in the fight against corruption, right? But that it's very exciting that they have this mandate and this popular support to do it.
And just one more example of how things have changed precisely. I saw this comment on Twitter. When López Obrador gave, at the time of his first Informe, his first State of the Union, remember the opposition governors were trying to create like an opposition alliance of opposition governors back in the day? Didn't go anywhere, but they were trying to do that, create an alliance of opposition governors to oppose AMLO from their governorships. Now, the few opposition governors that remain, they were at the Informe. Just an example of how hegemonic the 4T has become since AMLO's first State of the Union compared to Sheinbaum's State of the Union. Hegemonic in the good sense of the word. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They really packed it in one day. I even saw a tweet from, I believe she is Claudia's photographer, Jessica, saying like, maybe don't pack all these historic events into one day. It makes for really long work days. But that's just it. I mean, incredible. Like you said, what a privilege to live in a country where there is that sense of optimism, where an ordinary Monday becomes extraordinary.
You've kind of forgotten what that feels like.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Ready to move on to our next topic? We're at the 23-minute mark. We want to make sure we have time to get into everything.
We've got an extra news piece.
We do. We got an extra story this week. But we're talking about Rubio flies to Mexico for security talks amid Trump's pressure campaign. President Trump has ordered military action against Latin American drug cartels and has threatened a new tariff. President Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico has pushed back. And before we get into that, I just want to mention that usually I don't always grab a story from the New York Times to illustrate the story we want to talk about. But I picked this one.
That we do that.
But I picked this one and I was like, wow, this is actually a good headline. And, the teaser and the body is actually quite honest about what's happening. Trump is trying to pressure. Rubio's part of that pressure campaign. Mexico's not saying. I was like, so surprising honesty. And that's because it was not written by the Mexico Bureau.
That is so funny.
It was written by a correspondent who came to cover Rubio's visit to Mexico.
They bypassed the Mexico Bureau. Good choice. Good choice there, actually. So you finally get a little bit of journalism happening.
How about that?
Yep.
So what do we make about Rubio's visit to Mexico. I kind of gave the lead away there in a minute, or just earlier. I think it's just part of the pressure tactic. Apparently, if things go well, this will be the occasion where they actually finally sign the new security agreement. And apparently, the trouble there has been Claudia's defense of Mexican sovereignty, saying, no way am I going to put onto paper that I'm going to allow you to do anything that could even be remotely seen as a violation of our sovereignty. So we'll see if it's signed. It most likely will. My expectation is that it will. We'll know by the time this comes out tomorrow on Wednesday where things went.
She's been kind of downplaying expectations in that. She's been saying, there might not necessarily be anything signed on this trip.
But if it's not ready, then don't sign it.
Yourself into something.
Yeah. Right? But that's why Rubio is here. Rubio is here to pressure Mexico even more. It's kind of interesting that this tour starts in Florida with the ultra-right there, then goes to Mexico, and then goes to the ultra-right in Ecuador with Noboa there, which is a very different kind of. You want to see what it means to kneel before U.S. imperialism? Look at Noboa in Ecuador. I'm sure they'll get exactly the agreement that they want. They'll probably get the agreement to get bases there. That's what I expect.
I'm sure.
An expansion of U.S. military presence in Ecuador. It's going to become, as I said on Sin Muros today, it's kind of the role that Colombia played for a very long time of the unsinkable base of the United States inside of South America.
And, as Alina Duarte pointed out also today on Sin Muros, if you kind of read what Rubio's priorities are for the trip, right? Security and fentanyl and precursors and this and that and what else. This is a trip of the United States imposing its agenda. This is not like, a diplomatic trip of, making that idea doesn't even exist in Trumpism. But the idea of, meeting with a foreign country to, strengthen diplomatic relations and, address common concerns. The list just read straight out like a whole list of what the U.S. wants. Straight down the list, straight down the line. Right? So that puts, Sheinbaum in this position of playing defense of, having to hold the line on this, and this in order to have the space to keep doing what she's doing in the State of the Union address, as we saw.
That's right. I'm glad you make that connection, actually. That's a really good point. That all of this, we have to remember, right? Like Mexico's future cannot be defined strictly on its relationship with the United States. It's about what are we doing domestically? How much room do we have to operate given how aggressive and interfering the United States wants to be in our country? And so you're right, playing defense, kind of defending our sovereignty, but also promoting precisely what we talked about in the first segment, which is these achievements.
And even the New York Times has admitted this must have been another piece not written by the Mexico Bureau. Even the New York Times admitted that Mexico is just getting fed up with exactly what we've said in the program. I mean, we're not Nostradamus here, but you don't have to be to figure it out, that you just keep giving to the Trump administration, and they just keep demanding more.
Yeah.
They just keep demanding more. So Mexico has been very cooperative on the security front, very cooperative on handing over capos, very cooperative, without, letting the U.S. encroach on other areas, very cooperative on drone overflights. And the Trump administration just simply demands more. So, that doesn't work. They try to put you in a situation of damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Because if you oppose them, then, they'll come at you with everything. But
they'll put some ships outside your waters like they're doing in Venezuela.
But if you give in to them, they'll just keep taking everything you give. They try to put you in that damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. So, Sheinbaum has desperately been trying to find a third way out of there. Not a Clintonian third way. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a way out of the double bind the U.S. tries to put countries like Mexico into that don't oppose us. But if you, give in to everything, we'll just keep taking more. That's what she's been trying to find out of that kind of,
And as we saw in that Rolling Stone piece about these new aggressions, these new threats, right, against Mexico about using the armed forces to go after drug organizations, is that basically they're asking the impossible. They want Mexico to perform a miracle and somehow stop drugs from reaching the United States.
Yeah.
But as we've said a million times before, if you don't do anything about the demand side of things, you're not going to be able to solve this problem. What they're asking of Mexico ultimately, like solve this problem for us, because we refuse to use the same kind of tactics against our own citizenry for now. And it's asking too much. And eventually that's going to break, right?
I think
or maybe, and if we don't get an agreement out of this visit, I think it's going to be because of that, because they were asking for too much. And then we'll have to kind of reevaluate how much we're giving you, because negotiating with somebody who's that difficult is going to be a dead end. So you'll have to find a new strategy.
Don't we have another piece talk about Mexico's interesting meeting with the Brazilian delegation that came here to Mexico City? Is that the next topic? Or
That is the next topic.
What a segue.
What a great segue.
That's
Mexico-Brazil bolster trade relations amid U.S. tariff strain. And that is basically the story. There's actually not too much coverage about this in English available. That is the story I found on Mexico Business News, I believe it's called. But the long and short of it is, we know that Brazil has been in the sights of U.S. Trump's, more specifically, tariff policy. Yeah. They're amongst the most tariff nation in the world. Mexico, oddly enough, amongst the least tariffed, or if not the least tariffed, as a result of the shrewd negotiating.
And after Lula's bending over backwards to try to,
send a message to Venezuela, keeping them out of BRICS,
breaking the G7 closer to BRICS and leaving Venezuela out of BRICS, wherever else, where'd that get him, right? But,
So after some meetings where Claudia and Lula met G20. At the G20, at the G7, where they were able to have this exchange, it led to this meeting where the vice president, here you go.
What's his name?
Gerardo. No, I did it wrong. That wasn't good.
That was kind of
That was too German?
Yeah.
What was I going?
I don't know what that
Gerardo
was.
There you go. There it is. They were teasing me.
He was doing this in the rehearsal today for the show. Today when we record this. And we wanted him to do that when he read the news piece out, because we have 3 news pieces at the beginning of Sin Muros. But you didn't.
Sorry.
You didn't.
Geraldo, we're having some fun with it. Yeah. Anyway, Portuguese is a beautiful language. I love it. Wish I spoke it better. Yeah. Anyway, so the vice president comes to Mexico, has this meeting, brings a big high-level delegation. They meet with the president. They meet with high-level officials here. They reach a series of accords around health issues, around trade. They're talked about expanding commercial. But I think it's the symbolism of this meeting that I think is the most important thing. The fact that you have a gathering of the 2 giants of Latin America who are explicitly seeking to further strengthen their ties, both diplomatic but also economic, to say that, we are both heavily industrialized countries. We have a lot of capacity. We have large populations. We have stable finances. We have a workforce that is ready to work, and we should be trading with each other. And I think this is the beginning of a beautiful relationship if it's able to be deepened. Obviously, there is a lot of distance there, and the infrastructure isn't quite in place in terms to facilitate trade directly. But, Mexico is bioceanic.
Ethanol. I don't know where that came from. Why are they so big into ethanol?
Well, I think there's some energy cooperation agreements as well.
No, energy cooperation
Petrobras,
great,
it's a state-owned company, but it also has private investment. So they've actually kind of gone more towards the direction of new technologies, whereas Mexico is very much still kind of like, drill a well and suck out the oil kind of strategy, which actually has limited Pemex's ability to do more kind of deep water stuff in the Gulf of Mexico, for example. But anyway, I think it's the beginning of something, but there has to be a follow through. The symbolism is fine. These small agreements that were reached, it's a good first step. But there's obviously a lot more work to be done because we have to dismantle all of those physical and psychological barriers that exist between greater integration between the economies of Latin America with each other that isn't kind of passed through the United States.
That's right. Now, what I meant just very briefly with ethanol is that ethanol also has environmental consequences. So I think there are other ways to go with regards to, green, joint green projects. Anyway, I am excited about that cooperation. And, it's just an example of how this global chessboard is changing at an accelerated pace because of the Trumpian threats. It was already underway. It was already going on, but it's just, everybody knows now the stakes are that much higher and things are moving that much more quickly. Just look at what happened at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit.
Let's look at that. China Xi seeks expanded role for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization at the Tianjin Summit.
Yeah.
That's our headline from AP. We're talking about the geopolitical changes. This was a big one. It's not a small thing to see leaders who don't particularly like each other.
No.
Modi, Putin, Xi, all together and talking about cooperation. And you hit the nail on the head. This is very much about the U.S. pressure.
Yeah.
This is about the results of U.S. policy. In fact, we were looking for a losers and haters, and I came across Andres Oppenheimer. We did not choose it because it's like shooting fish in a barrel when it comes to Andres Oppenheimer. But he made the point, and he's actually kind of right. U.S. policy is pushing countries together into each other's arms. In that sense, he's not wrong. I mean, he laments it.
Oppenheimer saying
like I said, he laments it. He thinks it's he says they're doing favors to left-wing countries, saying, they're rescuing them, even though both Lula and Sheinbaum are actually pretty popular in their respective countries. But there's truth to that the world is changing, and this change is being accelerated because of Trump.
And it's just, just go over it quickly, right? India started importing large amounts of Russian oil after the sanctions that were placed on Russia in 2022.
Correct.
Right? Russia started sending its oil to, India at a discount. India would then refine it and then sell it to Europe. So it was just a workaround of the sanctions because, refined products weren't included in the sanctions. So that's how that all got going. And also because, Europe was left without another option with regards to energy, which is why they're buying, liquefied natural gas from the United States at a markup, right? So the United States made out very well on that deal, right? Europe is getting rooked. So
and signed an agreement to buy even more gas from the U.S. to pay even more for it.
Just recently, right? Van der Leyen's doing a hell of a job over there. So then the Trump administration gets angry at India for doing what? Importing Russian oil, which was, the United States and European policy did propitiate. And then said, all right, we're going to slap 50% tariffs on you, like they did with Brazil, just like Brazil, thinking that they would make India buckle because, U.S. is India's number one trading partner. What happened? Well, Modi isn't like, Macron, isn't like Keir Starmer, isn't like these, spineless European leaders we have now. Not a Modi fan, but Modi is not that easily pushed around like the current crop of European leaders. So he's off to Shanghai. And now you see a triangle of the world's three largest nations, right? And this is keeping in light of the fact that India and China have historically had quite a few issues, including border issues and other. So to see the three of them there together, well, it was quite an event. And now you see why U.S. policymakers and U.S. lackeys like Oppenheimer panicking.
Yeah.
They're panicking. And why is this related to what we're talking about? Because Mexico just met with Brazil. They had a very productive meeting there. And Mexico is seeing and must see that the U.S. policy of, bludgeoning and threatening and gunboat diplomacy, which we're seeing with Venezuela, that's running out. Even Marco Rubio admitted it, right? Very recently. The United States only has about 5 years more to do that because, and when 5 years will run out, enough of the rest of the world won't be using the dollar as a reserve currency that the whole sanctions thing won't work anymore. They'll have their own payment systems and their own banking systems, their own way to do transfers. And we already saw the counterproductive effect of the sanctions in this particular case, right? Do you think Mexico doesn't see that? You think the rest of Latin America doesn't see that, right? The emperor increasingly has no clothes on this. And I hope that leads Mexican policymakers right now, as they're negotiating that security agreement, right now, as Marco Rubio is showing up here, to stand strong and not buckle. This is absolutely not the time to buckle on these kind of things. Absolutely not the time, however threatening the United States is being. Because they have simply less leverage, the U.S. does. That's just a fact. And they're trying to cover that all up with all this bluster.
And that's just it. It's a cover, right? I think you're right. In a lot of ways, Oppenheimer is a bit of a canary in the coal mine, and a warning of the panic that maybe is starting to set in. And let's not forget that this tool that Trump wants to turn to so constantly, tariff policy, was just shot down by a court.
A federal circuit court, 7-4 vote.
Yeah.
Now, they put a stay on it. Very convenient. The stay allows those,
the policy continues.
The policy continues one way or another. It's all the tariffs that he invoked under the IEEPA, right? The Economic Emergency Powers Act, I think is what it's called, right? Which is most of them. All their, judgment, what was it? Retaliation Day? What was it? Just stupid movie
Liberation
title.
Day.
Liberation Day. All of those were caught up in this. The other ones on aluminum and steel and cars, those stay in place because he used another justification for those. But, if the ruling holds, those tariffs are gone, and the U.S. government is going to have to pay out millions, billions, I don't know how much, in reimbursements.
Oh, is that the ruling? It says you actually...
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's what they're really worried about. All these companies that had to unfairly, illegally shoulder those tariffs, they get their money back.
But the damage has been done.
But which is why it's going to the Supreme Court, and we know, what the U.S. Supreme Court is like. So they're very likely to uphold it, just because King Trump and his little courtiers over at the Supreme Court, they might just uphold it. Although obviously the Circuit Court decision was the correct one. Congress has the power to apply tariffs, because the tariffs are effectively a tax, and you can't just declare this open-ended, broad-based, no evidence-based emergency to justify any presidential maneuver. Right? That's what he's doing at the border. That's what they're doing to, justify the ICE raids and all the rest. So, if the United States had anything like a functioning judiciary, this would be gone. These tariffs would be gone, right? But one doesn't have high hopes with the U.S. Supreme Court, obviously.
Do a judicial reform.
Do a judicial
We
reform.
just finished celebrating the arrival of the new court. This could
reform.
be you.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of steps beforehand.
A lot of steps.
All right, we're at the 40-minute mark. Let's talk about our last story for today before we get to losers and haters. And that's this from El Financiero. This is just a headline about the story of the week last week. Noronha demands Alito Moreno, the head of the PRI, his impeachment after clashes in the Senate. Quote, he told me, I'm going to kill you, end quote. So, Alito Moreno is a very dubious figure.
Oh, yeah.
Alito Moreno has a lot
And
of very
that's why
serious...
his nickname is Vandalito Moreno.
There we go.
There you go.
A long series of accusations of corruption. He apparently lives or has a house that's worth 300 million pesos.
Right. In Campeche, where he was governor.
That's
before going to Congress.
Wild. Mm-hmm. How can you possibly reconcile that? Mm-hmm. Where did he get that money? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so
that's $15 million house.
To recreate the scene for you, right? So what happens is the Permanent Commission, which is the group of lawmakers from both the Congress and from the Senate, from the lower house and from the Senate, who manage the affairs of the Congress while they're in recession.
The joint affairs, right?
Yeah. And so they were having their ordinary session. The session ends. They're singing the national anthem. And Alito Moreno, in what seemed like a planned attack, an emboscada, an ambush, with a group of other lawmakers, some of which are not part of the Permanent Commission, who were only there as thugs.
They had no reason to be there in the first place.
Surround Alito Moreno at the podium, and then try to interrupt him as they're singing the anthem. Finally, he kind of desists and wait for it to end. And as soon as it's over, he goes up to him, grabs him by the arm, right? Tries to say, how dare you? You didn't give us our speaking rights.
Turning to leave, the Speaker of the Senate turning to leave after kind of fobbing him off, saying, let the national anthem finish, for God's sake. He's kind of like this. He turns to leave, and Alito grabs him by the arm and brings it back, and then you can see it in the photo, slugs him once.
Slugs him. He misses, but imagine if he would have hit him. This is a man who's 15 years his junior.
Right.
Like, he could have caused harm. Mm-hmm. And so, anyway, so there's a whole scuffle there. You can clearly see it. The video's available. We can share it in a link below if you're curious to see it. Tries to get away. Dolores Padierna, who's a very petite woman, also, older, trying to get him out of there. And then we see one of his lawmaker thugs, Alito's thugs, grab Noronha's coat to drag him back and try to smack him one last time. Meanwhile, like you said, they're also threatening, saying they're going to kill the Senate worker who stood in between Alito and Noronha.
I mean, that was hurt. Pushed a cameraman to the ground and started kicking him on the ground.
Yeah. I mean, what does that say about, Vandalito Moreno, Alito Moreno? What does it say that he's just that comfortable with violence? This is the guy who said he wanted to kill journalists through hunger.
That's right.
Right? Like, this is...
Starve them out.
This is the representation of the opposition in Mexico. This is who they are. They are people who are just a little bit too comfortable with violence, who don't respect democratic outcomes, who then, after doing this, doubles down and threatens more violence. I said this on social media. I won 100% behind Noronha. He should be impeached, right? Alito Moreno should be impeached.
I agree.
He should be kicked out of the Congress. There needs to be a line drawn to say this kind of behavior is grossly unacceptable.
I totally agree with that. And, let's put this in perspective as well, because we just last week on the show, we were talking about Lili Tellez, another senator from the PAN, the other opposition party, and her treason, right? That was the name of the episode, right? Traitor in our midst, right?
Oh, yes.
Basically, calling for U.S. intervention, right? Ted Cruz was also calling for Mexico to accept U.S. state troops, right?
What was it? Amablemente?
Yeah, amablemente. Right?
A friendly offer, something like that.
And we said last week, and I think it's important, that we were not in favor of Lili Tellez suffering a sanction for that because she would just be martyred. Because it was speech. It's traitorous speech, but, she said it in a Senate debate. It's, unfortunately protected speech. So I agree with you here. But this is different. This was physical violence. This was Alito Moreno aggressively going after the Speaker of the Senate and then aggressively going after a cameraman and threatening them, mafia style. And you do have to draw a line with that. You absolutely do, because if not, they'll be back for more. And if you don't believe it, just look at what happened. Yesterday's recording this 2 days ago from Wednesday, when they burst into a session in the House of Representatives, the Cámara de Diputados, and tried to do the same thing again. They tried to do the same thing again. And they even allowed Alito to speak.
Yep.
And he's not in the he's not in the deputy. He's a senator. And he was up there threatening and making an ass of himself. It didn't go anywhere. They left and the session continued. Just to make that point. They didn't succeed in preventing the session in the House. But are they going to do this now every time something happens they don't like? Is that it? And if you try to compare it to what, the left did when it was in opposition, the left was never beating and kicking people.
No, of course not.
It was defending popular positions like opposing the privatization of Pemex, and sometimes it would occupy the podium.
Or when they tried to stop Calderon's illegal inauguration.
But it was never in the case of physical violence and threats.
Yeah, of course.
In that way. And they were in selected cases with broad popular support when a real atropello, atropello contra la nación was being perpetrated, right? A real, attack against the nation, right? What you see here now is a Mexican right, electorally lost, adrift, going nowhere, without leadership, without a program, without principles, without anything. The PRI is even in danger of ceasing to exist as a party. Flirting ever more with violence as, a normalized political tactic.
Yeah.
And you see that they're taking a page out of Trumpism, and they're taking a page out of Mileiism, right? And they're taking a page out of the rise of the global far right to try to push it and see how far they can push. Now, Morena's decision so far has been to not do anything. Again, to not try to make them into, causa celebre, right? And also to not give Alito the justification he needs to seek asylum in the United States because he's got criminal proceedings against him that would proceed if certain figures in Moreno would let him proceed, and if they would actually go ahead and strip him of his political immunity, which they could do at any time. But there are figures within Moreno that don't want that. So, their Alito remains. There's something to be said to letting him hoist himself by his own petard and making himself just, that's the kind of the Mexican thing. You kind of avoid open confrontation, let them just string themselves out and look ridiculous and play themselves out. That might work. That might be the right way of doing it. But there's also a danger in not doing anything because you're giving space for political violence to be normalized, and we know where that leads.
That's exactly it. Mm-hmm. That's exactly it. If you allow me, I would like to read a little bit from the column I wrote for the Mexico Solidarity Project Bulletin, which gets right into this. Mm-hmm. So just real quick before we move on to our final topic. The right's new violent consensus.
Yeah.
In their desperation, right-wing forces across the globe have crossed the line. We are witnessing the emergence of a consensus that is not only tolerant of violence, but fully embraces it. An ideology centered on the threats of violence or even right homicidal intent. Mm-hmm. Over the last few weeks, this disturbing pattern has manifested itself in the assassination of Yemeni Prime Minister Ahmed al-Rahawi, the U.S. deployment of Navy ships off the coast of Venezuela, and the attack on Mexican Senate President Gerardo Fernández Noroña by opposition politicians. The normalization of violent threats and actions by not just fanatical right forces, but also even so-called moderate opposition is a terrifying development. In the same week that we saw U.S. military maneuvers in the Caribbean aimed at intimidating Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, or by some accounts the harbinger of an invasion or assassination attempt, we saw Lili Tellez, Mexican senator, openly call for U.S. military intervention inside Mexico. Whether it be Venezuela or Mexico, unilateral military action by the U.S. would result in civilian bloodshed. This point cannot be emphasized enough. Via Marina Corina Machado in Venezuela, or Tellez, or Alito, in Mexico, their calls for help from the U.S., from the military, can only mean one thing: the killing of innocent people. And of course, there's a lot to be said about the media's role in also perpetuating this as well.
Oh, God, yes.
Just getting to the very end here. Porrismo, a Mexican term for organized violent groups who intimidate or harass political opponents, and the PRI have a long history. And Moreno's comfort with violence is troubling, if not surprising, but a line must be drawn. Numerous U.S. political figures, such as retired General Michael Flynn and Congressman Carlos Jimenez, have issued combative statements calling for Maduro's ouster, justifying it by drawing on the U.S.'s baseless claims about his purported place at the head of a criminal organization. Here in Mexico, politicians like Diaz have alleged that President Claudia Sheinbaum's government has ties to organized crime. Will it be long before the two start calling for the U.S. to, quote, take out the president? This is why the Mexican opposition's recourse to violence must be stopped in its tracks. It is a slippery slope that will lead us to horrible places. I'll end there.
Hear, hear. We've got a writer at this table, don't we? Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a writer.
And of course, you want to read the full thing. It is available on the Mexico Solidarity Project Bulletin. Check it out. We also put it on the MexicoSolidarity.com website, but figured I'd share that with you here.
Absolutely. And, you're so right about the corporate media reaction. Because you would think that the least the media could do would be to condemn basic violence like this. Even the head of the PAN did that.
Yeah.
Even Jorge Romero the PAN was able to do that basic thing. Not the Mexican corporate media. No.
They went to great pains to justify it, saying that Noroña had been asking for it.
He'd been asking for it because it had been a heated debate, and the whole thing about traitors to the...
It's apology for fascism.
Nation, came up. No. Sorry, there's no justification for physical violence anytime, anywhere. In this kind of case for political violence. Right? And what you see is people like Joaquin López Dóriga with this kind of rancid old man machismo saying Noroña ran away.
Yeah.
Right?
He was
or
a coward.
Paloma Sanchez, he ran away. No, that's called avoiding a stupid confrontation, you idiot. You idiot. Right? Oh, Noroña ran away. What are you supposed to do? Right? Answer that kind of violence with more violence to satisfy your machito little commentaries, right? Ciro Gomez Leiva had Alito on the next day so he could launder his image on his Radio Formula program.
And of course, Ciro Gomez, who apparently was the victim of an assassination attempt, still not clear what happened there, received an outpouring of support from Morena politicians, including Noroña. Who's like, no, this kind of violence is unacceptable. But Ciro comes along and defends the undefendable of the violence aimed at Noroña.
Tercer Grado, the other roundtable program on Televisa, Raimundo Viva Palacio, René Delgado. It was just disgusting.
Endless.
It was just endless, disgusting justifications of this kind of political violence and thuggery. So, case study of what Mexican corporate media is like. Right? Justifying violence and finding any way to kind of twist the argument to justify it.
All right, we have about 5 minutes exactly.
Okay,
for losers and haters. I want to throw this story up here. This is from Human Rights Watch. We gave you the preview. Mexico, electoral process undermines judicial independence. So Human Rights Watch comes out against people voting for their governments.
Yeah.
Weird. What's the story? I mean, we could go on for a long time about Human Rights Watch. I've been incredibly critical of them and their work in Venezuela. I think Human Rights Watch, in a lot of ways, plays the role of providing liberal cover for U.S. imperialism, U.S. intervention in places like Venezuela. Basically echoing all of the claims of the opposition, giving an audience to these allegations, which of course opens up the door to intervention. I think a lot of what we're seeing right now in Venezuela is a product of these decades of trying to smear the government of Nicolás Maduro in this instance, alleging that they're human rights abusers, that they're undemocratic, that they're dictators, et cetera, et cetera. As I've mentioned previously, I'm somebody who's very passionate about human rights, and it makes my blood boil to see them weaponize, instrumentalize human rights in order to advance U.S. imperialism, which is the greatest threat to human rights. They've been good on Palestine. I'll give them credit for that.
They have,
but that's about it. Kurt, I know you were doing some research. We got about 3 minutes here.
Okay. Well,
let us know.
Very, very, very quickly. It's exactly what it is. It's liberal cover for U.S. imperialism. And that's why you have, people who have had roles with Human Rights Watch, right? Like Tom Malinowski, a speechwriter for Madeleine Albright, Miles Firket and Michael Shifter, both of whom held senior roles in U.S. diplomatic institutions like the State Department. And guess what? National Endowment for Democracy, people in its governance and advisory structure, Susan Manilow, vice chair of the board, longtime ally of Bill Clinton, Bruce Rabb, a staff assistant to Nixon during the U.S. bombings in Indochina, Miguel Diaz, a former CIA analyst who provided oversight for U.S. intelligence in Latin America. The list goes on. And of course, we know where it gets its funding, places like, Open Society, the Ford Foundation, it's foundations, all of the foundations that we know. And you think that doesn't affect Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Tides Foundation, etc. And just very quickly, if you read through the article, it doesn't hold water at all, right? One of its criticisms is that the evaluation committee of the federal judiciary, there were supposed to be candidates for judges chosen by each one of the three branches, executive, legislative, and judiciary. What happened is the judiciary branch under Norma Pina, decided to not do their work as a way to try to gum up the whole process. So what happened? The Senate had to do their work for them. And they're saying, well, look, all of the candidates were chosen by either the executive or the legislative that has more than majorities. That's because the judicial branch refused to choose their candidates. They refused. They boycotted their own responsibility. Do you understand that? They boycotted it. They could have chosen candidates. They chose not to gum up the whole process, right? And then later on, it's talking about how judges have to have, judges have to have guaranteed tenure, there it is, and be protected from political influence. Yeah, they have to have longer terms than politicians. But the problem is the previous oversight, committee that was supposed to sanction judges for corruption never did because it was in the pocket of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So now there's going to be an actual judicial discipline tribunal that has actual teeth to sanction judges for corruption. They don't like that in open society. They don't like it. Because they don't situate the case in the Mexican reality or in any reality. They just have these abstract principles up here that don't understand or don't mesh at all with the actual realities on the ground of how do you handle corrupt judges then? How do you handle corrupt judges? How do you handle corrupt judges on the U.S. Supreme Court? Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, untouchable. And that's what the Human Rights Watch would consider to be a good judicial system. Well, sorry, no. Mexico is putting in teeth so that corrupt judges, after forever of getting away with everything, can finally be sanctioned. Sorry, not sorry.
This all has an end game. The end game is to lay the foundations for further U.S. intervention in Mexico.
That's right.
That's what I think is happening here. Because if you look at the language from people from like America Society, Morena now controls the three branches of government. Right. Oh, well, that makes people think it's a dictatorship. Mm-hmm. And therefore, dictatorships should be toppled, should they not? That's what we're playing at here.
That's it.
Thanks so much for joining us. I do another episode of Soberanía. We want to wrap things up to make sure we have time to close everything out. Again, if you haven't seen it, check out our interview. If you don't speak Spanish, turn on the subtitles. I worked really hard on them. And watch it. And share with your friends. Anything else? Oh, we're going to be doing a show on Thursday this week.
That's right.
So we'll put that on our social media. Follow us if you don't already. You hear all about it. We're going to do a little chit chat with somebody from the United States who's curious to learn more about Mexico.
That's right.
And if you're interested, you got your own program, hit us up. We will always love talking about Mexico. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Take care.
Recordamos a esos políticos hipócritas e irresponsables que México es un país independiente y libre, no una colonia ni un protectorado de Estados Unidos.